Hello again, gamers and gamettes, and welcome to another episode of Not So Hardcore Gaming. I'm your host, Jeremy, and today we're talking about Forza Horizon, as you would guess by the title. Now, over the last month, I've done a few different things, and I haven't done as much game talk. I did E3 updates, did a special episode, and then I gave you updates on the podcast, what I plan to do in future, things like that. So, obviously, it's now time to do game talk, as I would normally do, and I chose Forza Horizon for one of two reasons. One is, during my E3 episode, I mentioned that Forza Horizon 5 is coming out soon, and I was saying how excited I am to play that, and I haven't really played Forza Horizon 2, but very soon I'll be able to play Forza Horizon 3, which I'm excited about because it's set in Australia. But Forza Horizon, the original, is one of the first games I've played. I got it on the Xbox 360, which is the first console I ever personally owned. And I thought it was a good way to start. And obviously, if I'm going to talk about a game, I want to start with number one when I can. So, this is one I've played quite a bit, I'm excited to talk about, and without further ado, let's get into it. First up, as always, is visuals and audio. This is how I start every episode because this is what is most important in terms of games. It has to draw you in terms of visuals and audio, especially racing games. Obviously, like back in the day, you had text adventure games. You still got those now, and those don't require visuals, but most games now are very important and very much need to be visually appealing. So, the visuals for this game, I still like. This is a game that released in 2012 on the Xbox 360, so there's only so much you can expect from it. You know, it's an older console with a lot less power, so expecting too much wouldn't really be fair. But looking at it, to me, it still holds up today. Obviously, it's not really, really good, but playing it, I never looked at it and thought, oh, that just doesn't look good. You know, it always pleased me to look at. If you compare it nowadays to newer ones, obviously it doesn't hold up at all. But playing it, the car models were really good. The distances, where you'd see hills off in the distance, it had waterfalls where you had a photo mode to take them, and that was often an objective you had to do for a certain outpost, things like that. So it had good views to look at. And even just when you were racing, you know, if you go up close to the trees, things like that, obviously it doesn't look as good. But when you're racing past them, it has just enough detail that the blur, things like that going fast, it still looked alright, you know, and you had to really study things to be able to say, okay, that doesn't quite work. So visually, a lot of the scenery was beautiful, but the cars were very detailed, I found. When you had garage finds, you'd find them in poor condition. They were rusty. They didn't look good. And then you'd see them when they're done, you know, they've got the shine and looked really good. And I loved to watch that happen. But any car really had just enough detail that, especially if you wanted to change the paint, you wanted to put decals on it, it was satisfying to look at while not being extremely detailed. So not only for the time, but even now, I think it holds up as a really beautiful game. And I cannot say anything negative about it visually. Now, in terms of audio, obviously the cars sound good. There are a lot of different sounds. Each one will sound just that tiny bit different. If you've got a slower car, it doesn't sound quite as aggressive. If you've got another one, you really hear it turning. Obviously, with the amount of cars there are, there are only so many different sounds you can have, but I found I never heard a car engine and thought, that just doesn't sound right, or that just doesn't appeal. I found I was always very happy with the sound of it. If you get into crashes, you'll often hear the scraping of metal, and visually you'll see sparks flying, things like that, like little details which went well for it. In further audio, the music, it had quite a bit of music. I never really concentrate on music in the game, but, you had the different radio stations which played different songs, and it had a good selection. It sounded good in general. As I said, the radio I can't speak in detail about. I don't even remember a lot of the songs that were on there, but, if you were into a different type of music, you could just change the radio station. And I did like the detail, you could actually just turn the radio off if you didn't want to listen to the music. And that would have especially been useful for streamers and Let's Players at the time, because if you have other music, you can get copyright claims. Whereas if you just turn the radio off, you don't have to worry as much, which I can't say I think that was intentional, especially in 2012. Let's Plays were only on the rise, but I wanted to quickly mention I did notice that detail, which I liked, and that's just one perspective of why it is better. But the next and probably most important part of the audio is the voices, the characters in it. There really aren't as many characters, I wouldn't say. You've got the main one who talks to you, tells you where to go. I liked her voice. She was voiced very well. Your own character, I don't think, ever speaks. But you've got the other races that you play against, and each of them have their own little character. They have their own way of talking, and I like when each one has just enough character that, you listen to them and you don't just think of it as a robot talking to you, so to speak. It has a good way of talking to you where it's not fake, so to speak. I know that sounds hard to explain, but, you feel like it is actually a real person talking to you, the way they voice the characters, the way they talk to you, and I very much enjoyed that. So when it comes to the visuals and audio for this, I genuinely don't have any complaints at all. I very much loved both aspects of it. Moving on, we'll talk a little bit about gameplay. Now, there's only so many things I can say about the gameplay. I can't speak from a perspective of, the way you control the car is realistic. I have no clue. I'm missing my right leg, so I can't even reach the accelerator. So driving is not my forte, so to speak. But the controls, I found it worked well. You could customize it to your own playing ability. You had assisted braking. That was the main thing, which I always needed help with as well. You had the option to give you a line which would warn you when you needed to start slowing down. You had a control which would make the other races better or worse depending on your own skill level. So you had enough customization that you could tweak it just a little bit and it will be different each time. If you wanted a higher difficulty for more of a challenge, you could do that, and you also got increased rewards for it. You've obviously got faster cars controlled differently to slower cars, and when I'd fully accelerate, I felt the speed for it. The braking seemed more realistic to me, and obviously you could upgrade your braking, not your baking. So the amount of customization in the gameplay suited me very, very well, and once again, I don't have any complaints from that perspective. I had a lot of fun right from start to finish, and in fact, I've played the game multiple times. So, as I've said, I don't really have any complaints in terms of gameplay. It didn't get boring for me, and it was one I could go back and play again quite happily. So, moving on to the next, obviously the visuals, the gameplay are the two biggest things. Next, which is one of the most important as well, is the car selection. And again, for the time, there's only so much they could have, but I felt there was enough to keep me guessing, enough that if you chose a different car, you could play it slightly differently. As I always like to say, there has to be a good level of customization in terms of gameplay. So having different cars which handle differently will also change and make it more challenging. So the car selection I liked. I am the type of guy I still tend to stick to a few select cars. But obviously I'm not good with brand names, anything like that, but you had some of the big names out there which you could choose from, and that would have a few different models from those companies. So I liked it. You had some which I look at it and you've got like the Beetles, old ones, the really, really crappy cars, and you think to yourself, no one would be using these except for races where you have to use that car. But having them there, I think, would be better than not having them there. It's strange, and I know it sounds contradicting, but that's how I've looked at it. And there's not much else I can say on it. The car selection I was very, very happy with. And once again, no complaints I can give in terms of that. Now we come to one bit which I actually very much enjoyed. And that's the popularity mechanic in the game. Now, I was never really the type to be doing tricks. Drifting, I was never really good at. And there was only really so much you could do. But for this game, if you did tricks, if you did like drifting, going over jumps and landing properly, the basic things you would do, your popularity would go up. And you started right from, I believe, 200 or maybe 250. And as you went along, you got more rewards for doing more. And it really appealed to me in the end, which I found quite surprising. I found that I was actually willing to go and purposely do these tricks. And that added an element of challenge for me, while also being a fun mechanic. One bit I loved especially for this is there was one area where you could go in particular that it was a fairly open area, and it had a few different divots, a few obstacles to drift around, and it was the perfect place to go if you needed to boost your popularity level. So that mechanic in general, while I never would have thought I'd like it before I played the game, just worked. It worked really well for me. And it's, as I said, it's interesting when I come across a game mechanic which, from an outward perspective, I would look at it and say, no, I don't really think that's my thing. But then once I actually play it and I get used to it, I find it really appeals. And in this case, I think the game was so much better from this mechanic. I think if it didn't have that part of it, it just wouldn't have appealed quite as much as it did now. So that genuinely surprised me. Now, one of my other favourite things for it were the special events. And by this I mean, in one particular instance, you're racing against an aeroplane. Obviously, the aeroplane has to do slightly larger loops, things like that, but it's one thing I never thought I would see in any video game is, you're racing and you're racing against a bloody plane. And it was just the coolest thing to me. And I don't know, it's just something about it. It seems so outlandish, but it really worked. It was exciting, it was fun, and it genuinely surprised me to see in it. Now, obviously, I can't list every event that you had there, but that was one that stood out. And I felt I would just briefly mention the fact that you have that in the game. It is something completely different to the rest of the game. And having it there, again, it made the game better because there was just that one thing that it had, which I didn't know of any other game that had something like that. So, very well done for that part. Now, earlier, while I was talking about the gameplay, I mentioned about garage finds that you have. Now, what that is, for those who don't know, every now and then you would find, like, you'd be contacted and they'd say, oh, there's a rumour of a car, an old rundown car that you have to go and find. You'd go to the area and you'd search around until you found an old barn with the car inside it. And then once you find it, you do a little bit of racing and then you get a call that it's been repaired for you. And there are 9 different ones for it. So there's a little bit to find, and then all you have to do, I think if you raise your popularity level, it makes it more likely that you get them. So it's just an extra little thing to do, and it gives you more of a reason to drive around the map as well. One thing that I loved about it is what I found was one of the best cars in the game was one of those garage finds. If you upgrade it correctly, it had almost max stats. And it was one that you could get very early on. You didn't have to have a high rank. You didn't have to play through the game as much. You know, sometimes when you finish the game, that is when you get the best cars. Where in this case, you could get that halfway through the game and then it would give you a lot more fun free roaming. So the garage find aspect was awesome, and I loved that one of those garage finds was sort of a sleeper hit, so to speak. You know, you wouldn't expect it to be as good as it was, but it turned into this really cool car. Now, I have one last thing to talk about for it, and then I've got 1 or 2 notes which I'll mention. Now, the decals, or you being able to change the looks of your car. Obviously, this is essential to any car game, is you have to be able to customize the ride in terms of visually, not just upgrading them, but changing the looks of them. This, I found, had more than enough visual customization. You've got all the colors, and you could tweak the color to your perfect mix. You had brightness, saturation, all those scales just let you find the one that's perfect for you. You know, just by changing the color, you could have so many different options for what it will end up looking like. Then when you add all the wraps, the vinyls, things like that, and the fact that you could put on any amount of them that you wanted to, that really appeals to me, especially as someone who I like to think I can be quite creative. Having the visual customization itself, as I said, is essential, but the degree of visual customization that the game had was very impressive for me, and especially because it had features where you can upload them and you can see other people's designs. It also added a term of community, so to speak. So the visual customization for every car I very much love, and I think the game did very, very well. Now, I've spoken about that, and I did have one last mechanic which I thought I would talk about, and that is, during the game, you can find certain signs that you crash through, and there are 100 of them, and every single sign that you destroy makes all your purchases later 1% lower. Now, this, I think, without this, the game would have been a lot less outstanding, so to speak. It gave you a reason to drive everywhere, to cover every bit of the map, because once you find all 100 of these signs, you can buy any car you want and upgrade it fully, completely for free. So it was a reason to go searching for everything. And as I said, I haven't really seen many other games that have it, and it was so much better because of it. When you have an open world for racing and there's just not as much to find, it's just not appealing. Whereas this, it had that extra little feature to it, not to mention the speed traps, the speed zones, the photo mode that you had. When everything is combined, there are so many reasons to go driving everywhere. You know, you've got some buildings you have to go through, like you've got a big barn and you have to drive through there, and there are jumps in it. There are a discount sign here or there. All of the different things you had to find keeps you playing for longer. So all the secrets hidden throughout it, I found, kept me playing, and obviously I'm not the best at finding them, so I did have to go online to find where some of them are. But it was a good mechanic, and I found I don't think anyone has ever complained about it. And I think there's nothing that you can say makes that a bad mechanic, so to speak. So it's one I just wanted to mention because I think the game was a lot better for it. I haven't played enough of the later ones to know if this is also a feature in the latest ones for the series, but I sure as hell hope they're in there because I found that was a fun mechanic. So, with that being said, there is one last thing that I wanted to mention, and this is probably the only thing I found the game could have done better. Once you've upgraded your car and you go to an older race, it scales your car down. Now, I can understand obviously making it a little bit closer between your cars for the opponent and yourself because you don't want it to be too easy. Although I think it would be good to have that option where you can say it's a custom mode and you can play against the base level with that fast car. You know, everybody likes playing a game and then when they go back, they like being OP, so to speak, because it just lets you let loose. And if you've got that race which you've struggled with for ages, and then you beat it, and now you've got that better car, you can go back and play it again, almost as a form of revenge. So I think it would have been good if it had that, but it didn't. But the fact that it scaled your car down, I found was a bit more of a detriment, whereas newer games, it will scale the opponent's cars up. And I think that is a much better way of doing it because you can still have your really fast car. And if you don't have as much powerful car, you can't drift as much. Things like that. So it's just not quite as fun racing. So I think if they had have scaled the other cars up instead of scaling yours down, it would have made it much better. And that, I think, is really the only detriment I can find for the game. And that's surprising. I said there's so little I can complain about the game, and that's the only one that comes to mind. So that's everything I can say about the game. And obviously I would just make it very clear, I love the game from start to finish. I've played it multiple times, and while I've played other things now and I haven't played it in a while, I would be more than happy to go and play it again now if it were handy, because I've always found it was enjoyable. With everything said there, that's my take on Forza Horizon. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. There will obviously be another episode next week, and very soon I will be playing Forza Horizon 3, which I will be excited to talk about on the podcast as well, as it is set in my homeland, Australia. So that's everything. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and Have a good one.